Okay, look, I get that that may not be the most fitting tapestry to use for this video, but just roll over it, alright? I don't really have the rest of my Fate Stay Night stuff just like lying around readily available except for the Tamamo figure over there, so we're just gonna have to live with this for now. Just let it be. Either way, the Fate Stay Night visual novel, the remastered one, just released on Steam recently, and people were already very quick to point out, especially on day one, all of the funny bugs that they found. You can find all the compilations and memes over on YouTube, on Twitter. Yes, I'm gonna keep calling it that still even till this day. As well as all of the other weird things that happen, and it would seem that the solution to all of that was simply to just change your computer's locale to Japanese. And it was kind of funny seeing people talk about this on like Reddit like 1-2 days ago, being like, oh, I don't know how you do this, but apparently this is a thing you gotta do. And it's like kind of funny just simply due to the fact that for most people, especially people who have been playing visual novels from like 10, 15, 20 years ago, this was something that used to be so common that it was pretty much just common knowledge to anyone who played the majority of visual novels out there that this was something that had to be done. And as someone who has worked in the visual novel industry in the past, and who has a lot of friends who still do, and arguably are a lot more competent than I am in all of this, and have a lot more of understanding of the industry than I do, who I really have to thank them for helping with this video, help to explain some of the stuff to me as well. I figured we could talk about this because many of you boomers out there, you're already probably feeling really nostalgic hearing all of this talk about locales. This is really one of those only 90s kids remember this sort of moment, and I really do mean that, since like the majority of people who were born in the 2000s, the first time they would actually have been able to legally touch a visual novel would probably have been in like 2018 or something. So most people probably wouldn't have gotten to experience the era where all of these locale things were actually an issue, because we do see that when it comes to more recent releases, especially those on Steam, this hasn't really been an issue that has popped up very much. So unless you're one of those people who were born in the early 2000s and who actually went back to play many of the classic titles, or who actually plays many of the titles that are purely Japanese release, hey, good on you, you're a pretty base like visual novel enjoyer overall, and mad respect to you. But to everyone else who's like, but I'm born in the 2000s and I played many of the visual novels that had that back in the day, good job. You pretty much just self-reported yourself, outed yourself of playing visual novels that might have been adult content, related, while being underage. So well played. You just owned yourself here. But look, before we get even more sidetracked, fact of the matter is that when it comes to the whole idea of changing your locale, it is something that has become less and less necessary over the years. And the fact that such a big IP apparently completely forgot to like prep for this issue beforehand, and the speed at which they actually managed to deal with it kind of shows that someone just probably forgot to put something in at some point. But that said, I figured that we could take this opportunity to talk about why this whole locale thing is even an issue in the first place, and what could have potentially caused this specific title, one that should have been aware of this issue, to end up in this situation as well. And when it comes to this, there are really two parts of this issue. There is the technical side as well as the human side, because remember, no matter what you're talking about out there tech related, right, software, games, or just like tech in general, the tech itself can only really be as competent or good as the people who are developing it. You can just feel free to ask any of the people who were involved in the production of that one quadruple A title, the one that was half coded by interns and was stuck in dev hell for 6+ years. I'm sure they can really attest to this issue. So the tech side answer is pretty simple, or pretty complicated depending on who you ask. For me, I'm more of a designer side person than a programmer, so while I do have some level of understanding of it, it's not as in-depth. So I'm pretty sure there's going to be someone who's going to be able to do a much better job explaining all of this in detail in the comments, assuming anybody watches this video and actually leaves a comment. So I'll try to make it simple for the people who don't really understand most of this like programming, like mumbo jumbo magic that's going on here. So many Japanese companies, even till this day, still simply do not use Unicode for its character encoding, and are still instead using SJIS. For those of you who are wondering what the hell this like weird long-haired man here is talking about, basically we are talking about ways of character encoding. This is basically how you would store the data that is all of the text and characters that exist in a language in data form so that it can be transmitted and displayed on another screen. Stuff like if I want to do something like and have all of the weird effects pop up, the way that would all be saved is basically by using the character encoders codes for each of these individual characters, saving this string of it and then telling the whatever needs to display it like this string so that it will be able to display it there. So the thing is that the one used in Japan and the one that is used typically in most of the rest of the world is very different. In fact, the original game engine that many visual novels, including quite likely the original Fate Stay Night, was designed on, Kitty Kitty, is one that only supports SJIS and didn't support Unicode at all. And if you're someone who has worked in programming in Japan and then you came in from overseas, you're probably just traumatized by the lack of proper systems that can support Unicode in some places, where some companies would sooner just write an API to convert the ShiftGIS systems that they work on into like Unicode for the rest of the world through something else instead, because they would rather just use this instead of whatever is commonly used outside of Japan right now. And precisely because the way that the characters are encoded is different, it basically means that if you were to take one system's code and try to put it into the other, there is the possibility that it is either going to give you something that is completely different, or hell, the code may not actually even be used in the other system, and therefore it's just going to get some weird gibberish coming out instead. But that said, with modern games, this is a little less of a problem since most of the game engines nowadays are more centralized, right? With stuff like Unity, for example, you do have the ability to continue to use ShiftGIS, and all you really need to do is just download the right tools to ensure that whatever you have written, it can then go through a tool that will be able to read it and then just produce and show the game to people outside of Japan, even without them needing to change their locale. And with something like Kitty Kitty nowadays, you can download, because of the fact that the engine itself is open source, some tools that people have made that allow all of this to be done easier. However, with many of the older titles, especially if you played visual novels back in the day, or if today you're trying to play one of the older ones, the big issue is that, especially for the smaller visual novel companies, their thought never actually came into their head that these are games that would actually be popular enough to actually see play outside of Japan, and many of it was actually designed with the intent of just, oh, this is going to sell and be mostly produced in Japan, and so we're not going to really bother with all of these conversions and the like, since all of it works fine where we live. And this is something that I still see being talked about even till this day within some of the companies I worked at, and wherein people are going like, oh yeah, you know, but our games have a more anime aesthetic to it. And when you look at like America, for example, people really seem to like their buff British orcs and their Andromeda persons. So this is clearly, our game is just not made for that audience, disregarding the fact that there are many people who do enjoy it, but it's all simply information that just doesn't really get to them. Hence why many of these games are created in SJIS, and that's why you need to change your locale so that you actually get the right character encoder, so that you can actually view all of the text in a way that wouldn't cause the entire game to bug out as well. Because we're not just talking about text in the game bugging out, but even some of the things that might be written throughout some of the other files may bug out in ways that may cause the game itself to, cause stuff like this to happen. Of course, as some of you might say, but wait a minute, we've already come so far, right? It's the year 2024. We've already produced AI models, and on top of that, we've started to see some of them collapse just simply due to the fact that they started to like eat the shit that is their own data as well. So how are these companies in this day and age still not using something that is even more prevalent than it was all that time back? And considering the fact that communication with the rest of the world, that there's better understanding of how popular anime subcontinents can be in the rest of the world, how have companies even till this day not realized that all of this is an issue till now? Considering the fact that people have already created workarounds in the open source engine itself, why is all of this even still happening in this day and age? Well, we'll get into that second part of the question later, but as to the part of why, in spite of the fact that Unicode is so prevalent today, many companies or just developers still do not use it, there are multiple reasons, most of which are pretty old and boomer at this point, in that many of the technical issues that people bring up with the whole using SJIS over Unicode thing tend to be very old, and with modern day Unicode, it isn't really much of a problem anymore. But there's also the human side to this issue, and because of all of these human side emotions that exist, it does feel like a part of that is probably what allowed SJIS to be reinforced within the nation and adopted to the level that it has been over Unicode as well. And that also makes it a lot harder for people to want to shift over at this point. So we'll be going over some of those now. That said, when it comes to popular websites such as Nico Nico Doga as well as Hatena Blog, you do see that many of them have actually started to swap over to Unicode. And when the websites or the games are big enough, typically this is something that's already taken into consideration, simply because they know that there is a much bigger global audience for their titles as well. The first reason that I see being brought up quite a lot is the Han Unification of characters. For those of you who do not know know what this actually means at all, basically the kanji used in Japanese as well as the Hanzi used in Chinese are all from the same ancestry that initially started within China. And then as it spread to all of the other countries, they used it and changed it, and the language evolved differently in all three of these different countries. And therefore, you do see kanji that looks kind of similar across all of them. And what Unicode basically has done is that it has basically taken all of the similar looking kanji and it just lumped them together under a single code. This led to a weird issue back in the day where you do have the very unique cases where if you wanted to display the Chinese and Japanese characters side by side, you couldn't really do that because of the fact that they use the same Unicode. There's a pretty good article over on GitHub that actually explains quite a fair bit of this. I'll link it in the description down below. But basically, there's also the issue that Unicode, in a situation where it does not know which language it should default to out of all of the different range that it has, it will just immediately default to simplified Chinese instead. So let's say you're trying to develop something from overseas for Japan, there is the very real possibility that in the very weird edge cases where the software or the application can't figure out what language it is supposed to generate the character for, you actually end up displaying Chinese characters to Japanese people, which, as he describes in the article itself, it would be the equivalent of giving someone in English something like this to read. You know, it looks really cool if you're like 12 years old and you want a very cool gamer tag on like Xbox Live or something. But for everyone else, if you're gonna be reading through entire articles, playing through entire games, especially visual novels with all of your text looking like this, at some point it stops being funny and it just starts being really tiring and annoying because things just look a little off and most people would just rather their text look like something familiar instead. And in some very weird edge cases, it can actually confuse people since you do have situations where words, the characters can look so similar in one language like Chinese, for example, between these two. Whereas in Japanese, it kind of looks like this. So if you were to give a Japanese person who has never studied Chinese before this character here, they might actually get very confused. That, and there's also some level of a nationalistic push to it, which I don't really want to go into, since to me that whole argument feels a little mired in like emotion more so than an actual technical issue, wherein it, with many of the countries whose kanji as well as Hanzi, all of this is being mixed together into one, there are people who feel like this kind of waters down or devalues the art that the word itself is, because many of the characters in Japanese, Chinese, all of these languages, the thing is that much of the way that the character is designed, each individual word especially, is based off some level of how these things were perceived in the world many years ago. And so, like for example, the word river kind of looks like this because it kind of follows the shape of a river with water flowing and down the middle, kind of stuff like that. And so as these evolved over the years, people are just kind of pissed about the fact that their thing is not being valued as highly as the other thing and stuff like that. So we won't go too deep into that because I feel like it's kind of pointless for the topic of this video. But what is important is that especially in Japan, there was a period where in the 90s, in the early 2000s, you did have corporations and political bodies that did push to demonize the way that Unicode was designing all of these code sets for the encoding. So that in a way could have also affected the adoption of Unicode within Japan among especially some of the other companies out there. You don't want to be using the thing that the entire country seems to be up in arms about, and also due to the fact that this is probably going to be less taught in schools to the people who are going to learn these things because potentially of all of this, it's better to just use SJIS, which people are probably going to be more familiar with as well. So yeah, a little more human side issues overall, to be honest, because the technical side issue really only used to be an issue back in the day when they didn't have enough integers to get out all of the different codes that you could use for the kanji, and there were just too many of them for Unicode to want to just divert purely to just Chinese, Japanese, and Korean alone. But nowadays, the number of integers in a code has increased, so they do have the space. It's less of an issue, but at the same time, the stigma that existed from back in the day, probably as well as the inertia from the fact that these SJIS systems have been used for so long, makes it very difficult for people to want to make the hop. The second reason is that there isn't really a very super efficient way to convert characters from Unicode to SJIS and back. And so the issue here is that some of it may get lost along the way, because as you convert from one to the other, you need a table to do that. And what it's basically going to do is it's going to try to find the corresponding pairs and use that to basically convert between the two. But for specific characters, sometimes there is the possibility that characters that exist in one character encoding may not exist in the other at all. And when stuff like this happens, data loss is basically going to happen during the conversion itself. And if there isn't anyone there to actively check all of this out, it might actually result in issues going forward as data just starts to be slowly lost here and there within the file that is being converted. And as such, when it comes to legacy games as well as software, there's a very high propensity for companies to just want to leave it untouched, because as it is, it's already bad enough that all of these softwares are probably black boxes where no one actually knows how the code at its very core works anymore after all the years have passed, and the engineers who may have developed the stuff have already left the company. And as a result, they would rather run with just these encodes rather than to swap and risk the data loss that they themselves may not be able to ascertain properly. I don't know, maybe there is an AI nowadays that might be able to do it. If there is, I just don't know an access, so I apologize, but for the longest of times, that has been one of the arguments that has been made for this issue. And the third reason is string size and memory usage. Now, for those of you who are very old, older than I am even perhaps, because I'm not at all, you may also remember the era where RAM used to be like 128 megabytes big. Or maybe you came from the era where diskettes were a thing and like having like 10 megabytes of memory was considered something super amazing. Well, back in the day, memory used to be a lot more of an issue. And I still remember, because like some of the vision novel companies I've worked in the past, they did talk about this as well. It's the interesting thing that there are many visual novel companies, although not all of them, that actually use megabytes when they talk about the game size instead of using like the number of characters. And they wouldn't say like, oh, our game is 10,000 characters long or something like that. Like the ones that I have spoken to, many of them also use things like, oh, our game was like 35 megabytes big, and everyone else within the industry will listen to 35 megabytes and go like, oh, it's that big, cool. And the reason for that is because every single character typically uses a very consistent number of bytes. So the issue with Unicode back in the day was that it used to be a little bit more inefficient than using SJIS instead. For those of you who are wondering, the byte is basically like the micro penis of the data storage world, right? It is as small as it gets. The only thing that is smaller is really just the bit, which kind of rhymes with another word that has int at the end of it. So that will probably be even smaller. So that's the smallest. But aside from that, yeah, it's pretty much just the micro penis of it all. And then from there, you just go into kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, and terabytes. Well, most of you realize today, even a single terabyte hard disk is no longer enough. But back in the day, the space did kind of matter a lot more. And the thing is that the more words there are in the game, obviously the bigger the file is gonna get. And when you add in everything from the graphics to the sound and everything else, the game can get fairly big for a computer for that era. Nowadays, you could say it's less of a problem, but the fact of the matter is that considering that this has always been a thing that worked out for them and used to work out better, there's obviously some level of a stigma against using Unicode, as with some of the other issues that we've talked about here. And so, you know, people just fall into the belief that, hey, if this thing ain't broken, why fix it, right? Right? So the issue here is kind of twofold, wherein Unicode has, for the longest of time, been something that was less efficient for the Japanese language, and so really there was just a much slower adoption of it. And over the years since then, while it is true that Unicode has gotten a lot better, it's also true that because of the fact that SJIS has simply worked better for the context of Japanese people making stuff for Japanese people, there just really wasn't much of a reason for many of the companies to make a hop. And when you consider that many of the veterans who work in the industry are the people who most likely used to work in that era, many of them would have been very used to working with SJIS, and they wouldn't really have as much of an incentive to suddenly make this change, especially since there would be some level of a stigma that may exist in the minds of some of them against Unicode as well. Couple this with the fact that within Japan, for the longest of time, especially for the much smaller visual novel companies, there's a huge language barrier that exists between them and the fans overseas. It's very hard for them to try to understand the state of the games outside of Japan, especially since if you are one of the boomers who used to play many of these titles back in the day, you most likely had to pirate the titles because they just simply weren't sold outside of Japan. And the only way you could play the English version was to download like some kind of fan patch because no official translation existed for many visual novels as well. So they didn't really have a good way to track or even understand that there was a fair like fan base for that game outside of Japan at the time. And the issues that these people suffered in terms of the locale. And therefore, for many of them, they also would therefore not see any incentive to try to change all of this in the first place. Like just the other day, I was talking to a friend who works in a visual novel company still today, and he was talking about how for the English and Chinese releases of the title that they're working on, the company actually asked him to check the game on a English and Chinese OS. You know, because clearly we all have our own version of the North Korea, like Red Star OS or something. You know, maybe there were people who saw the Microsoft bimbos back in the day and they thought like, oh, you know, maybe the people in the West, they use something that's different, right? Maybe they have like Mega Heart or something, I don't fucking know. And so like, they're like, ah, yeah, you know, we need to make sure that our thing runs on their funny Gaijin OS or something, even though, you know, Microsoft is pretty much not even Japanese, but like whatever. Fact of the matter is that they didn't even know that locales were a thing, and when he tested the game on the locales for English and Chinese, obviously the games broke down and he told them about it, and they basically stared at him dumbfounded like, what the fuck is a locale even in the first place? So there are many people who are actually still fairly unaware of the fact that all of this is something that even needs to be dealt with in the first place. Granted, you know, when people like him tell them about it, then this is something that they will learn and will be able to apply to future titles as well, which is a great thing. You know, bit by bit, we'll start to see the industry pick up and understand that locales as well as character encoding is a thing, hopefully, and therefore they will remember to ensure to have something in their game that allows them to work around that, or maybe they'll just adopt using a system that just uses Unicode instead. It was still funny to see it happen and pop up in a title IP as big as Fate, considering the fact that Type Moon being as popular as it is overseas, feels like they probably should have known better. I mean, they have even released like Fate Noir Realta as well as many of the other version novels, and all of those were pretty much fine, so it was kind of funny to see that this was even an issue in the first place. But that said, the more stuff like this happens, especially to a bigger company, and the more people within companies push for the change and to get the people within the company to be aware that such things exist, we're probably going to see bit by bit the need for people to change their locale to get games to work decreasing over time, which does feel a little lonely and makes me feel extremely old, to be honest. You know, but maybe one day all of these issues will be truly fixed and it can really be a boomer-esque moment where we go like, back in my day we used to... Oh wait, give me a second here. Yes, see, Sonny, back in my day we used to have to change our locales to Japanese just to play our mobile games. Grandpa, what are you talking about? You used to use it to play visual novels. You've told us this story 50 times before. But yeah, all of that is kind of scary to think about now, the potential mortality of me as a human. But aside from that, it would be interesting to see the industry progress in the direction of slowly understanding better the needs and the technical, I guess not so much limitations, but the technical differences that are necessary to release their games overseas. Which is going to be great for the overseas visual novel community as more titles become accessible at a much easier rate than it used to be than in the past. But yeah, that said, that's the video for today. Thank you guys for watching. It feels like this one's a little shorter than the average, which it's probably doesn't bode well for the average if the average is too long, if anything. But either way, I have 2 more videos planned for the month. For this month, you know, this is going to be one for Comic Cat, hopefully by next weekend. That said, that's the video for today. I hope it was interesting. If you enjoyed the video, do feel free to like and subscribe, and do feel free to support me on Patreon or on PayPal if you want to fund the channel and me doing stuff. Not like buying this walking stick or something. I've had this for a long time. I just recently found it, so I'm really happy. Apparently it's been under my bed for a year. Thank you to the following very cool people for helping to support the channel till this point. Monetarily, funny money. No, it is good money, and it does help to, you know, afford stuff like the camera that makes it such that I don't look like I'm 5 pixels wide, and all the other stuff as well. So I am grateful to you guys as well as everyone else for watching, because it's thanks to you guys watching that, you know, it still helps me to fund all of this stuff, and it helps to like get the videos to more people, and I'm glad that all of you enjoy it. So either way, that's all for today. thank you guys once again, and I'll see ya soon in the next one. But until then, take care and bye-bye.